My name is Rachel Morgan, and I was flying home alone after burying my husband overseas. The plane was dropping through the clouds, and while everyone else pulled out their phones to tell family they were safe, I opened our family group chat and typed, "Flight lands at 3 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" I waited, watching the dots pulse on the screen like a fragile heartbeat. The first reply blinked into view from my older brother. "Just get an Uber." A minute later, my mother added, "You should have planned this better." That was all. No question about how I was holding up, no promise to meet me at the gate, not even a single word about the folded flag I was carrying in my lap. I pressed the phone face down on the tray table and stared at the seat in front of me, refusing to let the tears rise. People imagine family as the net that catches you when you fall. Mine had just stepped aside and watched me hit the ground. The landing gear thudded beneath us, a heavy punctuation mark at the end of a sentence I didn't want to finish. I whispered to myself that I would manage, though the words sounded hollow in the recycled air. The plane shuddered onto the runway, and as it slowed, I felt the silence from my family settle around me like a second coffin. I still had to walk out of that airport carrying more than luggage. The jet bridge smelled of metal and recycled air. I stepped into it with the folded flag pressed to my ribs, my backpack strap carving a line across my shoulder. Around me, passengers surged forward with the relief that always follows a safe landing. I moved slower, aware of the weight I carried. The terminal opened into a blur of glass and chatter. Voices rolled over me. Hellos, laughter, suitcase, wheels clattering. I listened for my name like a faint note in a noisy room. Nothing. No brother, no mother, only the echo of their replies on my phone. "Get an Uber. You should have planned better." At baggage claim, I found my suitcase black and plain. It rattled when I pulled it upright, reminding me of all the times my husband had taken the heavy bag without being asked. Grief is measured in the weight suddenly left to you alone. Outside, winter air slapped cold against my face. The pickup lane flickered with brake lights and horns. I searched the curb anyway, convincing myself I might spot a familiar car. Nothing. A rideshare driver waved. I shook my head. That's when the SUV rolled up, black paint swallowing the light. 3 men in dress uniforms stepped forward. The tallest one said my name and quietly took my suitcase. The second Marine shifted to my far side. The third waited until I was inside before shutting the door with careful quiet. We slid into the stream of cars. The airport receded. No one asked where my family was. The silence wasn't judgment. It was space enough for grief, enough for breath. I kept the folded flag in my lap, tracing the edge of one star. A billboard flashed by, a tribute to those who served. I looked past it to the river bridge he had loved. My throat tightened. I blinked hard and pressed the flag closer. We pulled into a coffee shop. One Marine asked if I wanted a few minutes, somewhere still. Inside, the barista set a cup of tea in front of me without charge. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the heat steady me. At the next table, a couple murmured words, "News airport widow." My chest tightened. The tall Marine leaned toward me. "They filmed you," he said. His eyes were steady, not pitying. I nodded. He set a small wooden box on the table, tied with a white ribbon. "This was his," he said. He didn't tell me to open it. He simply left it there, as if truth itself was heavier than he could carry for me. I stared at the ribbon, biting into the grain. Not yet, I thought. Still, I pulled it closer. Outside, cars flowed by in a restless lines. Somewhere beyond the glass was the life I had once shared. Now, the only map I had left was sealed inside that box. Steam blurred the window as I lifted the lid of the wooden box. A folded sheet of paper lay inside, edges worn from being carried too long. Beneath it, a photograph of my husband captured mid-smile in the glare of the sun. My hands shook as I opened the note. His handwriting slanted unevenly across the page. "Don't waste yourself on those who leave you standing alone. Look for the ones who show up." The ink had smudged where his thumb must have pressed. I read it twice, then pulled the ribbon tight again, sealing both grief and instruction inside the box. At the next table, a couple murmured words I didn't want to hear, "News airport young widow." My stomach sank. The tall Marine leaned forward. "Local crew caught you yesterday," he said. Traffic story. They filmed you coming out. His voice carried no pity, only fact. Heat crept into my face. Strangers had already seen me walking with the flag pressed against my chest alone. That evening, I sat beneath our wedding photos, still hanging on the wall when the news replayed. My image filled the screen, shoulders, squared steps, measured the folded flag like a shield. The clip lasted seconds, but it cracked something open. My phone rattled with messages, neighbors, classmates, church members. My mother's name flashed twice before vanishing. I turned the phone off and let the silence cover me. Grief doesn't beg for more witnesses. It begs for space, but the world had already crowded in. The next morning, a producer called asking for an interview. I wanted to refuse to disappear into private mourning. Then I remembered the line in my husband's note, "Look for the ones who show up." Maybe it was my turn. So I went. The studio lights burned like a second sun. The anchor smiled with professional sympathy. "Do you have anything you'd like to say to your family?" The question hung between us like a dare. My throat tightened. Then, steadying my breath, I said, "Blood doesn't make someone family. Presence does." The anchor blinked, surprised. I kept my face composed, not out of pride, but because composure was the only armor I had left. By the time I stepped outside, the clip was already online. Thousands watched. Some comments were cruel, most compassionate. A veteran's wife wrote, "I wish someone had been there for me when I came home." A college friend I hadn't spoken to in years messaged, "I see you." That night, my mother posted an old photograph of us on the beach with the caption, "Family above all." The comments beneath it turned sharp. "Where were you when she landed?" My brother messaged me privately, "You're making this worse. Media only fuels hate." I stared at the word hate, remembering every time he had chosen silence over courage. I didn't answer. Unable to sleep, I walked the neighborhood. Street lamps threw long shadows across the pavement. At the church on the corner, a hand-painted sign announced a candlelight vigil on Friday for military families. I stopped to read. A woman locking the door asked, "Are you the one from the news?" When I nodded, she smiled softly. "Then we'll see you Friday." Her words were simple, not pity, not performance. They felt like a hand on my shoulder. I went home, set the wooden box beside the folded flag, and touched the ribbon again. My husband's message echoed louder than my family's silence. Friday couldn't come soon enough. Friday evening settled cold and clear. I carried the folded flag in my arms as I walked toward the churchyard where the vigil was set. A string of yellow lights traced along the fence, swaying in the breeze. People clustered in small groups, each handed a candle, with a paper guard to catch the wax. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke from chimneys nearby, and for the first time since coming home, I felt the hum of belonging press around me. A guitarist strummed near the steps, not the anthem, not even a hymn, but a familiar folk song that everyone somehow knew. Voices rose together, low and steady, and the sound threaded through the cold night like warm cloth. I lit my candle from the flame of the woman standing beside me. The tiny spark jumped between us, a bridge of fire so small it shouldn't have mattered, and yet it did. I watched the flame quiver, realizing this was what my husband had meant. You don't need grand gestures, just presence, just light carried forward. The crowd thickened as the hour went on. Families came with portraits of sons, daughters, spouses who never came back. Some cried openly, some stood stone still. A few reporters circled the edge, but kept their distance, their cameras respectful. I felt both exposed and sheltered, as if grief had built a roof overhead, but left the walls open. Then I saw him. Across the lawn, near a dark oak tree, my brother stood. David's hands were buried in his jacket pockets, his cap pulled low. He stayed just outside the glow of the candles, as if proximity alone might absolve him without the risk of stepping fully in. Our eyes caught for a second, and he looked away quickly, pretending to check his phone. My stomach clenched. I didn't move toward him. Instead, I stayed rooted among the circle of strangers who had shown up. My candle flickered, wax running down the guard onto my knuckle. I let it burn. After the song ended, silence swept over the crowd. The pastor spoke a few words about sacrifice and memory, But what I heard loudest was the absence at my side. When the vigil ended, people embraced one another, promising prayers, promising calls, promising not to let anyone walk alone to the parking lot. I slipped away toward the sidewalk, the flag still pressed against me. I could feel David's gaze trailing from behind, but he didn't follow. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket before I reached the corner. His message glowed against the dark. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to make it worse. My fingers hovered over the screen. Words crowded in anger, disappointment, the simple truth that he had chosen convenience over courage. I erased them all and wrote, "Grief builds walls or bridges." You picked your side. Then I hit send. The three dots appeared, pulsed for a moment, and disappeared. I stopped beneath a street lamp, the flame of my candle nearly gone. Around me, people walked arm in arm, carrying light into the night. The air cut cold through my coat, but inside, I felt steadier. I realized something sharp. I had been waiting for family to appear at the gate to prove they cared. Instead, it was neighbors, veterans, strangers who had stood tall beside me. My brother's shadow shrinking behind me was its own kind of answer. I blew out the candle, watching smoke curl upward like a ribbon untying itself. I didn't know if David would try again or if my mother would call. But for the first time since the funeral overseas, I knew exactly where I stood. Among the people who chose to be present, I wasn't invisible. I was seen, and being seen, I thought was enough to start building something new. The morning after the vigil, I woke with the faint scent of smoke still in my hair, the memory of hundreds of candles flickering behind my eyes. The flag rested folded on the dresser, the wooden box beside it. I touched the ribbon absently, thinking again of my husband's words, "Look for the ones who show up." They weren't just instructions for me to follow. They were a blueprint for something bigger. I opened my laptop and drafted a short message to a handful of people I trusted. Neighbors, a nurse from church, a friend of my husband's unit. I asked a simple question: would you be willing to meet arriving families at the airport so they didn't have to walk out alone? It felt awkward to type, as if I were asking too much. I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. That afternoon, 3 of them met me at the arrivals gate. We stood together with nothing more than a piece of poster board where I had scrawled in thick black marker, "We're glad you're home." The first flight spilled passengers into the terminal, and most passed without a glance. Then a woman with tired eyes slowed, clutching a baby car seat. She looked at the sign, then at us. Her mouth trembled. She whispered, "Thank you," as if we had handed her something more than cardboard. By the second day, a Marine buddy of my husband's brought along friends. They stood tall at the curb, hands at their sides, when the folded flag came down the concourse. On the third day, a rental car employee noticed us and offered discounts for families arriving late. The circle widened on its own, like ripples from a stone tossed into water. The local paper called. A reporter asked if they could feature the welcome crew, as he phrased it. I hesitated. I didn't want the story to become about my family's absence, replayed again for strangers to gawk at. "Only if you film the faces of those arriving," I said. "Let it be about them," he agreed. The segment aired a week later, showing men and women stepping off planes into hugs from people they had never met before. In one clip, an elderly veteran wiped his eyes and said, "It feels like someone saved me a seat at the table." Within 2 weeks, we had a name, The Welcome Project. A retired teacher offered to make t-shirts. A bakery donated coffee and pastries for volunteers pulling late shifts. Someone from a church brought handmade blankets. People I had never met wrote to ask how they could help. The inbox overflowed. One evening, a call came from a man whose wife was flying in from deployment. "I can't leave work," he said, voice breaking. "Could someone just be there when she walks out?" We were. We held a sign with her name, and when she saw it, she dropped her duffel and burst into tears. She hugged each of us as if we'd been waiting for her all year. I carried the wooden box in my backpack most days. I never showed it, never explained. It was my reminder that presence didn't need explanation. It only needed commitment. Of course, not everyone cheered. Some online called it pity theater, accused me of chasing attention. My brother never commented, but once a small notification appeared, an anonymous donation under his initials. I stared at it for a long time, wondering if guilt had driven him, or love, or both, tangled together. I didn't reach out. Instead, I kept showing up. At midnight, flights at dawn, arrivals in snow and rain. The more I appeared, the lighter the folded flag seemed in my hands. It wasn't because grief vanished. It was because presence multiplied, spreading the weight across shoulders that chose to bear it. One night, after we escorted an elderly man whose flight had been delayed for hours, he turned to me with trembling hands. "My wife used to wait at this gate," he said. "I thought no one would ever stand here for me again." His words struck like a bell inside my chest. I realized then, the Welcome Project wasn't just about filling empty space. It was about proving that family could be built out of strangers who refused to let someone walk alone. Snow lined the edges of the sidewalk the morning I realized the Welcome Project had taken on a life of its own. Volunteers were already at the airport before I arrived, holding handmade signs and pouring coffee into paper cups. What began as 3 people with a marker board had become a small army rotating shifts, covering late-night landings, answering calls from families too far to drive. The terminal workers greeted us with nods now, as if we belonged to the infrastructure of the place. I walked through the concourse and saw a young woman cradling her newborn, stepping off a red-eye flight. One of our volunteers knelt to hold her carry-on, while another offered a blanket. The relief in her face reminded me of the day I first stepped through those same doors, carrying the folded flag with no one waiting. My throat tightened. This time I wasn't the one walking out alone. I was part of the circle waiting. At home that night, I opened my inbox. Messages poured in soldiers' parents, thanking us students asking to volunteer, strangers offering gas cards. Buried between them was a confirmation of a new donation, unsigned, but the initials matched my brother's. For a long moment, I stared at the screen, my pulse a slow ache. It wasn't an apology, not even acknowledgement, just money slipped into the project like a note pushed under a locked door. I closed the laptop without replying. A week later, rain fell hard enough to blur the airport lights. Our team still showed up, coats, drenched shoes, squeaking on the slick floor. We greeted a thin, tired man who clutched a duffel. His voice shook as he explained his ride had canceled. We drove him home through streets shining with water. In the rearview mirror, I watched him press his forehead to the glass, whispering thanks like a prayer. Moments like that stitched me together again. I didn't need grand closure, only these small seams of connection. Each night, I carried the wooden box in my bag, the ribbon fraying more with use. Sometimes when I sat in the car, waiting for a flight to land, I read my husband's note once more. The words had become less instruction and more affirmation. I was not chasing ghosts. I was finding the living. Still, grief shadowed me. On quiet evenings, I wrote in a notebook memories of our road trips, the way he loved the river bridge at sunset, the jokes that never translated well outside his voice. Writing became my private ritual, not for publication, not for posts, just for proof that our story had existed beyond the folded flag. One night, a storm grounded several flights and dozens of families spilled into the terminal hours late. Our volunteers scrambled arranging rides, sharing snacks, sitting with children half asleep on their mothers' laps. I carried hot chocolate to an older man whose son had been delayed from overseas. He clasped the cup with shaking hands and whispered, "I thought I'd be invisible here." His words pierced me, because that had been my greatest fear too, being invisible. I bent closer and said, "Not tonight, not ever if we can help it." In the following days, local papers ran features. A radio station invited me for a short segment. I chose my words carefully, never mentioning my family's absence, never centering myself. I repeated one sentence: presence is the simplest form of love. People seemed to understand. When exhaustion crept in, I remembered the woman at the vigil who had passed me a candle. That spark had led here to strangers holding signs and strangers carrying bags. And beneath it all, the silent truth that even if my brother and mother never stood at the curb for me, others would stand for countless people who deserved not to walk alone. I ended that week at the arrivals hall past midnight waiting for a delayed flight. The air smelled of bleach and jet fuel. When the door slid open and a weary traveler stepped into our circle, I realized the ache in my chest had softened. Grief hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled the room. Presence did. Autumn settled into the city with sharp winds and early sunsets. One afternoon, my phone buzzed with my mother's name. For a long moment, I considered letting it ring out. Then I answered. Her voice was smaller than I remembered, edged with hesitation. "Rachel," she said, "do you have time for coffee?" I looked at the schedule taped to my wall, the flights marked in black pen. "I'm headed to the airport," I told her. There was silence on the line. Then she said, "I could meet you there." I shook my head, though she couldn't see. "It's not necessary." She sighed, soft and tired. "I've seen what you're doing." After a pause, she asked, "Are you warm enough these nights?" The question startled me more than any apology. I answered that I had a coat. It was all we could manage, and somehow it was enough. That evening at the arrivals gate, we welcomed a young father traveling alone with a toddler. Our group gathered around him, taking the bag from his shoulder, offering a ride home. He whispered thank you again and again, as though we'd rescued him from drowning. On the drive back, I rested the wooden box on my lap. My husband's note had softened at the folds from being read so often. "Don't chase the ones who leave you. Look for the ones who show up." The words had led me here to this car filled with strangers turned family. Later that week, I stepped into the cold night after our last pickup and saw David waiting at the edge of the lot, a coffee cup in his hand. He didn't ask forgiveness, and I didn't offer absolution. We simply stood together, letting the steam rise between us like a fragile bridge. I no longer measure love in apologies or grand gestures. I measure it in presence. The warm cup offered the candle, shared the stranger who refuses to let you walk alone. That I've learned is how family is built. Thank you for watching. If you enjoy these family drama and revenge stories, please subscribe and join me for more every day.